Today we're going to talk about a classic thought experiment, Wittgenstein's Beetle, and the enduring philosophical problem of other minds. As a quick programming note, I'm going to mix the driving around with some animations and see how that goes. Let me know what you think. But to get back to the basic question raised by Wittgenstein, how can we really know what's going on in someone else's mind? In his groundbreaking work, Philosophical Investigations, Wittgenstein presented this beetle analogy as a thought experiment. Start by imagining a world where everyone carries a small closed box, and inside each box, they tell you, is a beetle. Everyone talks about their beetle, compares their beetle, although never directly, and even bases societal rules around the existence of these beetles. But here's the catch. You can only look into your own box. You can't see what's in anyone else's. So you're looking at your beetle, but how do you know that everyone else is seeing the same thing? Their beetle could be completely different, or maybe there's nothing there at all. It could be a different color, a different shape. It might not even be a beetle, but some other creature. In this analogy, the beetle represents a person's private, subjective experiences, their thoughts, feelings, sensations. The box? Well, that's the impenetrable barrier between one mind and another. We experience our own thoughts and feelings directly. That's our inner world. But how can we be sure that other people have that same kind of inner experience? I mean, we can see their behavior. We can listen to what they say. But we can never truly know what's going on inside their heads, their own subjective experiences. It's all hidden, a secret world we can only guess about, only speculate about. So you might ask, what's the point of this seemingly bizarre beetle scenario? Wittgenstein uses the beetle to challenge the way we think about language, meaning, and our understanding of other people. He's attacking the idea that we build our understanding of mental states, like pain, joy, or belief, from our own internal experiences and then project them onto others. Wittgenstein argued against a kind of Cartesian picture where we have this privileged access to our own inner world, a private theater of the mind. He's essentially saying, look, if the word beetle is used in this society, but no one can ever actually see what's in anyone else's box, does the beetle even have a consistent meaning? Could some people have nothing in their boxes? Could some have a cockroach, a tiny elephant? The point is that the actual content of the box becomes irrelevant to the public use of the word beetle. So it's not about denying that people have inner experiences. Instead, it's about questioning how we can meaningfully talk about them, given that we only have access to our own. This ties directly into the problem of other minds, a fundamental philosophical dilemma. We directly experience our own thoughts and feelings, but we can only infer the mental states of others based on their behavior, their words, their facial expressions. When we see someone wince and cuss loudly, we assume they're feeling pain, because when we feel pain ourselves, we wince and cry out too. But can we ever know for sure that their experience of pain is the same as ours? We're essentially looking at their beetle box and guessing what's inside. I suppose that some folks might find that a bit unsettling, this idea that we're fundamentally isolated, trapped within our own subjective realities. But Wittgenstein wasn't just trying to depress us with this thought experiment. Wittgenstein's solution, if you can call it that, lies in his concept of language games. He argues that the meaning of words isn't derived from some private, internal definition, but from how they're used within a shared public context. We learn the meaning of pain not by introspecting on our own pain, but by participating in the pain language game, the way people behave, react, and talk about pain in our community. So basically, it's about the shared behavior surrounding the word, the context, the social rule, and not some hidden inner essence. Let's think about it for a moment from a neurological perspective. We have mirror neurons, for example, that fire both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing that action. For example, if you see someone in a movie who's expressing sadness and crying, or in fear of a dangerous situation, like dangling from a high cliff, you might feel the same mix of emotions. This suggests a biological basis for empathy and understanding others' internal mental experiences. But even with this, we're still interpreting external cues. We're building a model of the other person's mind, but it's always a model, a construct based on our own experiences and the shared language game. So the beetle in the box might be different for everyone, or it might even be empty, as in the case of a sociopath. But the word beetle and how we use it in our shared language, that's what gives it meaning. It's the behavior, the shared understanding, that bridges the gap between our isolated minds, even if we can never truly know what's inside another's box. Wittgenstein isn't saying other minds don't exist, or that their experiences or lack of them aren't real. He's saying that our understanding of them is fundamentally shaped by the public, social nature of language. We navigate the world and each other through these shared language games, creating a web of meaning that allows us to connect, even without ever truly seeing inside each other's beetle boxes. This whole idea of other minds kind of leads to some pretty wild philosophical ideas as well. For example, some branches of skepticism basically say we don't have enough evidence to really believe that other people even have minds, a pretty radical idea. Although, I do have to consider that some people I see while driving around don't seem to have much of a mind. And then there's solipsism, which takes this even further by saying that your mind is the only one that really exists, and everyone else is just part of your imagination. How can we be sure that anything exists outside of our own minds? What if we're all just surrounded by philosophical zombies, beings that act just like us, but don't have any consciousness? I discussed this thought experiment that raises all sorts of questions about the difference between behavior and consciousness in another video a while back. Maybe in your beetle box, you're wondering if there are any philosophical arguments out there that support the idea that other minds actually do exist. Well, philosophers have come up with a bunch of different approaches to try and solve this problem of other minds. One of the most common ones is called the argument from analogy. It starts with the idea that when we experience certain mental states, like pain, we tend to behave in certain ways, like we might cry out or wince. And then we see other people exhibiting similar behaviors, and so we infer that they must be experiencing similar mental states because they act like we do in similar situations. Therefore, we assume they're feeling the same way as we do, basically an inference based on observed similarities. You might ask, isn't that a bit of a leap? Just because someone acts like they're in pain doesn't necessarily mean they are, right? Yes, there are definitely weaknesses to the argument from analogy, since we can't actually verify that our conclusion is true. Instead, we're relying on external behavior as an indicator of internal states, and that's not always reliable. Another interesting school of thought is behaviorism. Behaviorists say that instead of trying to guess at these hidden mental states, we should just focus solely on observable, real-world behavior. So instead of worrying about what's going on inside the beetle box, we just look at how people are acting. If someone is crying, for example, a behaviorist would say they are exhibiting sad behavior rather than assuming they are feeling sad. In this way, behaviorism kind of sidesteps the whole problem of trying to prove the existence of other minds by shifting the focus to understanding the relationship between behavior and the environment. Some think that the behaviorist approach oversimplifies things a bit by ignoring what's going on inside the box, the subjective experience. These critics of behaviorism argue that it misses out on the richness of what we call qualia, the subjective quality of experiences. Qualia is a tough nut to crack. Consider, how do you describe the experience of seeing the color red to someone who's been blind their whole life? You can try to explain it using metaphors and analogies, but you can never truly convey the actual experience of seeing red. And it's the same with all sorts of subjective experiences. We can talk about them, compare them, try to find common ground, but there's always going to be an element of mystery when it comes to the specific qualities of someone else's inner world. I've talked about qualia in some previous videos, but if you would like me to revisit this idea in more detail, let me know. To circle back to Wittgenstein, He had some pretty interesting ideas about language, especially the idea of a private language and how it fits into the other mind's concept. He argued that a language that can only be understood by one person is actually impossible. For example, what if you just invented your own words and your own meanings for things? Couldn't you have your own private language for your own unique experiences? The problem is that for language to be meaningful, it needs to have rules, and those rules need to be shared and understood by a community of speakers. The assertion he made is that if you're the only one who knows the rules, then it's not really a language. It becomes meaningless noise because there's no way to check if you're using the words correctly, since there's no external reference point. You could be constantly changing the meaning of your words without even realizing it, because there's no one else to correct you or confirm your understanding. What Wittgenstein argued is that the meaning of words actually comes from how we use them with other people. He said that meaning is grounded in public use and the way we use language to communicate with each other. It's that shared context that gives language its power. What allows us to understand each other and to build a shared world of meaning? So you might ask, how does this all relate to the problem of other minds? Are we saying that because we can talk about minds with each other, that means we have some kind of shared understanding of what that concept means? The fact that we can have these conversations about minds suggests that we're not just trapped in our own private worlds. It implies that there's some common ground, some shared understanding that makes communication possible. And that's a pretty big deal when you consider how much of our social interactions are based on the assumption that other people have minds like our own. But even if we can agree that other people have minds, can we ever really know what it's like to be inside their heads? For instance, can we ever be sure that their experience of pain is the same as ours? That's where things get really tricky. It's those pesky qualia in play. Again, the subjective qualities of experience. Those things that are impossible to describe or explain to someone who hasn't had the same experience. With our inner experiences, we can try to describe them and compare them, but there's always going to be a gap between our description and the actual experience itself. So even if we could somehow prove that other people have minds, we might still never know if they experience the world in the same way we do. Perhaps the best explanation for why people act the way they do is that they have thoughts, feelings, and intentions similar to the ones we ourselves have. Basically, this is an inference based on the available evidence since we can't observe other minds directly. But given everything we know about human behavior, it's reasonable to infer that other people have minds. Some esoteric thinkers have taken it a bit further, suggesting that direct perception of other minds is possible. They argue that through developing mental skills through practice, one can actually perceive the mental states of others directly through things like facial expressions, body language, and tone of voice. Some take it even further, suggesting that there is an ESP sixth sense that allows a skilled individual to directly tune into the minds of others, similar to how a skilled musician can hear and identify the exact notes in a melody, or a skilled chef can taste individual ingredients in a dish. For example, Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy asserted that by using spiritual exercises, one could develop sufficient telepathic skills to actually perceive the inner world of others. Of course, that's really getting on the wild and wacky side of the philosophy of the mind. I guess the real-world way to perceive other minds comes down to testimony. Testimony is simply what other people tell us. When someone says, "I'm feeling sad," we generally take their word for it. We don't usually demand scientific proof for those kinds of statements, right? Some philosophers argue that testimony is actually a very important source of knowledge about other minds. They say that it can even be a primary source of knowledge, even when we don't have any other evidence. So we're not just inferring from behavior or looking for the best explanation. We're actually trusting what people tell us about their own experiences. Of course, that raises all sorts of interesting questions about the role of trust and language in our understanding of other minds. It's about trust, it's about faith, it's about taking that leap and believing that the people we care about have their own rich inner lives, even though we can never fully know what those lives are like. We're constantly making these little acts of faith every time we interact with someone, and I think that's what makes human connection so special. It's a willingness to believe in each other, even in the face of uncertainty. So how do we navigate this if we can never fully know another person's mind? How do we build meaningful relationships and communicate effectively? Well, I think it starts with acknowledging that gap, that fundamental limit to our knowledge. We can't just assume we know what someone else is thinking or feeling. We have to be willing to ask questions, to listen deeply, to really try to understand the other person's perspective. It's about being open to the possibility that we might be wrong about how we're interpreting their words or their actions. Perhaps the best way to accomplish this perspective is by creating a space where they feel safe to express themselves fully without judgment, a method psychologists use with their patients. Of course, many of us are quick to make snap judgments about other people without considering how they might feel, without taking the time to imagine what it might be like to walk in their shoes, to try and see the world through their eyes. So maybe that's what some of those thinkers, mainstream and esoteric alike, were getting at when discussing other minds. It's about having empathy and making an effort to understand where the other person is coming from. We have to take the time to recognize that another person's internal experience might be totally different from ours, even if we're facing the same situation. It doesn't take some kind of mystical mumbo-jumbo to do this, no connecting through a shared field of consciousness that binds the universe together, just approaching relationships with a degree of humility and curiosity, recognizing that every person we encounter carries a unique and complex inner world that we can only partially glimpse and understand. I think the most important thing is to remember that even though we will never fully know what's going on inside another person's mind, that doesn't mean we should stop trying to understand each other as best we can. I guess that's all for today's drive. Let me know in the comments what you think about Wittgenstein's Beetle and the philosophy of other minds. And of course, do the like and subscribe thing for the YouTube AI overlords. According to my robotic assistant Matt, it makes those AI algorithms very happy if you can take his Beetle's word for it. I guess the idea that AI could have a Beetle box of their own could be a topic for another video sometime.